Green Room, the interview series. With me in studio today, the return of the fabulous Adam Bailey, ladies and gentlemen. We are here to talk about, as promised from our last interview, about Fringe and Fringe success or not Fringe success and what it means to do Fringe. Because you, sir, have just come back from a tour.
That is accurate.
What tour was it? What show? Tell everybody a little bit about the show.
I just did a show called Franz Ferdinand Must Die, about my desire to kill all the members of the band Franz. No, it was about the start of World War I. And I toured it Winnipeg, Saskatoon, and Edmonton. Sort of the golden mile of the Canadian fringe circuit. Winnipeg and Edmonton are very large fringe cities, and Saskatoon is a wonderful, wonderful fringe in between the two, which is a smaller fringe, but still has a really dedicated audience. I got to do this awesome show, taking it across the country, and talking about how there are unintended consequences to political violence and how young men get radicalized. So,
okay,
light topic of conversation.
Nothing serious at all. Nothing serious.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the show first. I'm curious. You are the writer, creator, director.
Yeah.
Fill us in on that aspect of the show, because I know in the baseline the show was your brainchild.
Yes.
So let's talk about the creation of this show that you toured.
Okay, so I've always wanted to do a show about this incident. It's always kind of been a back brain percolating kind of idea. I always found the assassination that started off the First World War to be a little bit ridiculous. It is known to be a comedy of errors, except a tragedy of errors.
It is.
And at the same time, we're living in a political climate where a lot of young men are being radicalized, and towards the right, but also there's radicalization happening not to the same degree and not with the same consequences, but there are radical thoughts being echoed on the left. And on my Facebook feed, there's lots of joke memes about guillotines and revolution and all this sort of stuff. And I got interested in the idea of doing a show where we talk about what the unintended consequences of that kind of politicalization is, and where things can go when we're not being thoughtful about the outcomes of our actions. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
And I know from direct experience as well as observation, this is not a foreign style of show to you. We go back to our collaboration, which you crafted and brought me in on, the assassination of Robert Ford, and we're not talking about this city's previous mayor. We're talking about the man who assassinated the Robert Ford back in the day, who assassinated Jesse James.
Yeah.
Yep. And then following that one, in my memory, which I saw, which was great success a couple fringes here in Toronto ago, the work on Henry Matisse.
No, not Matisse, Rousseau.
Henry Rousseau.
Yeah. So really light, easy access historic topics where there's no explanation needed to the audience whatsoever. The funny thing is, the way I write a show is people who don't know the history come in and are thoroughly entertained.
Yes.
But it makes it a really weird pitch. When I'm out on a fringe grounds, when I'm out in the public pitching my shows, I can get people to come in, but explaining it on paper to people, sometimes it's a complicated, like, so you're doing a show about Gavrilo Princip. I don't know who that person is or why I would be interested in it, and yet I end up with I got called a tour de force in Saskatoon. So the shows work, but they're weird.
They are all of the above, and I encourage you out there as audience members, if you have a chance to see an Adam Bailey performance, especially one that he has written, not to say that he's not good anywhere else, but especially one that he's written, go and see it. I can speak from being in one as well as being an observer of one. I wanted to see Franz Ferdinand, but I was performing myself the night you had it running in Toronto.
Well,
so
it's gonna come back. It's gonna come back. We're dedicated to bringing the show to Toronto. This conversation about radicalization and what happens with young men is important, and it's probably really important that an audience in Toronto, where we've had incidences of radicalized violence. The show was not uninfluenced by the van driver on Yonge Street. So I did look into incels, and surprisingly, found a really human approach to the incel problem from trans activist Natalie Wynne, who does the ContraPoint YouTube videos online. I don't know if you're aware of her.
Wasn't.
Yeah, she's a PhD dropout who was studying philosophy, and instead of doing that, decided to make really theatrical YouTube videos, possibly the most theatrical YouTube videos out there.
Wow.
And she gets credit with de-radicalizing a lot of people, and she does these dialectics where she takes on all sorts of different characters with different philosophical points of view. Almost all of them are trans. She is trans. And really elaborate costumes, really interesting, engaging points of views. And she has her most watched video is on incels. And this video really influenced how I wrote Gabriela Princip in Franz Ferdinand Must Die. Because it started talking about not just red pilling and blue pilling, but black pilling, where people who feel that they are so low on the male hierarchy, if they believe in this hierarchy of maleness, that they're basically worthless.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's a really dark
Yeah.
place. As I said, light stuff. There's surprisingly comedy in my shows. I am not selling that right now.
Not in this moment, but there is. I know for a fact.
But there's also comedy in that video. Like she is she does find humor in dark places.
Okay.
Highly recommend Natalie Wynne. She also has a great video called The Darkness about edge humor and where that isn't appropriate. So
Okay, that's interesting. To know.
Yeah.
Now, I'm curious about your own shows. You mentioned the fact, as you were describing Ferdinand, how it ties into the current state of events.
Yeah.
You know, history repeating itself, if you want. When you're writing a one-man show or any show that has this kind of context, do you actively write it in to try and mirror what's going on, or do you take a look at the events and lay them out and then recognize that there's a correlation?
Yes, both of those. I think I find incidences that interest me because of what's happening currently, but then I also, while I'm researching it, and as an empathetic writer, as someone who really gets into the character study, I can't help but find new things and feel new things for the characters that I'm writing about, and in that process I come to some new discoveries in the practice of making art. I think some artists come very didactically towards what they create. They want to prove a point. They have almost an essay-like thesis in what they're doing. But for a lot of people, the practice of creating art also means that you discover something new in the creation, and so there is a moment of reveal both for you and the audience. It transforms you and the looker.
Interesting, very interesting on that you're drawing somebody in. If I'm hearing correctly, you're drawing somebody in. You're creating your character not on a prescription, but by the end of it, on a reflection, it could be prescribed. Oh, I got him to be quiet for a second.
What?
As compared to writing with a formula and saying, this is what I'm going to hit. These are the points I'm going to hit to prove my point. You're writing something that you're drawn to and then recognizing the points after the fact, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's process. I certainly use a type of story anatomy where I recognize a character who has a flaw, who needs to change the flaw to get what they want, but in changing that flaw, changes what they want. Which is the same Dan Harmon's story doctor. That's I'm trying to remember his name now, and it's gonna just not be in my head. We'll do a post credit, and I'll be like, this is the guy. But there's a really great story doctor who talks about not wanting an endless goal and not being on a hero's quest. But if you ever watched the Meeseeks episode of Rick and Morty, the Mr. Meeseeks,
Okay.
it criticizes these two forms of writing and why they're flawed. So if your character has a goal that they will do anything for, you have a bad character, you have a psychotic character. And if you have a character that's just on a formulaic hero's quest, that's also not really a great character. We know what the hero's quest is, and it's kind of boring at this point. Truly interesting characters are people who are flawed, and in trying to achieve their goal, have to recognize their flaw and change, and in recognizing and changing, their goal changes as well.
Right. That makes sense. And from that, and this is, again, my experience with looking at your work, I find your characters empathetic.
Yeah.
Right? Are you intentionally writing them empathetically, or based on the structure that you're just speaking about, they come out empathetic?
Empathy is a big part of my life philosophy. the world needs more empathy.
Agreed, without question.
And that definitely was a huge part of writing Franz Ferdinand Must Die. Our inability to look at each other as people is sometimes what gives us permission to do violent things, because if striking you down means I'm striking down an idea or a villain or a monster or an office or a state or whatever it is that is you and not a person, that's what gives me permission to do that violence.
Right.
It's the dehumanizing aspect. So I think empathy can, in and of itself, can be a radical act.
I've heard the supporting that, and I agree with you. Implicitly, I agree with you, but I've heard that if the world knew how to practice empathy, there would be peace all around. It's, theoretical, of course, but in reference to what you're saying, I agree that empathy is a great power that changes the conflict dramatically.
Yeah. And that was part of what, when I looked at Gavrilo Princip, I wanted to look at this terrorist. Even he committed a terrorist act. That's what he's famous for. But looking at him as an empathetic character, because that's kind of the last thing he does. Like, it's not someone who created many terrorist acts, and he almost did it by accident. He's someone who historians have looked at as someone who could be a forebearer to our modern alt-right incel males, or could also be seen as a leftist student activist. He has both of those elements in him, and that was a neat give and take in that, like, how much of yourself can you recognize in this character? Now, then you get to platforming, and are you platforming someone who is despicable? And that's another problem to look at when you're creating characters like this, but I think it's more important to approach the world with empathy than it is to look at the world as a formula.
Agreed. Very much agreed. And as I say from previous shows I've done, being the character in the Robert Ford piece, as well as watching Henri Rousseau, both characters, great empathy from the audience to those characters, going, oh wow, got to look at them differently. And that's important, because you're saying about a journey where the character discovers and learns, and therefore their journey, their quest also changes as a result. So they grow, they move forward, which is great.
Well, and it's a lot of fun doing that. And sometimes, because I also am not always a reliable narrator in my shows, in the Henri Rousseau one, I change as the show goes on.
Yes.
Because I start off the show telling the audience how stupid this main character is, and by the end of the show, he's like the hero, and we should all try and be much more like him, which is a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was a great show, and I'm sure I'm dying for when Ferdinand comes to town. I'm encouraging all of you to keep your eyes out, and if I know about it, I'll make sure I give a shout out when appropriate. When it does come to town, come and see Franz Ferdinand Must Die.
Yeah, come see my show.
Yes, absolutely. Now, on that note about your show, I want to come back. We promised the viewers previously to talk a little bit about Fringe and the success and the failure associated to it, the challenges, anything on the above. And I'm curious, from your personal perspective, was this tour a success?
Yeah, I had multiple sellout shows. I got 4 stars from the CBC, from Global News. I wasn't expecting to get a review from Global News, but they gave me a 4-star review. From the main paper in Edmonton, the Edmonton Journal got 4 stars. Got 4 stars from the Winnipeg Free Press. And got called a tour de force in Saskatoon. Pretty happy about that.
Congratulations!
Yeah.
All well earned. So you've run a successful tour. 3 cities.
Yeah.
In total.
3 cities in total.
Okay, so 3 cities in total. You've run a successful tour. You're a Toronto-based actor who went out west, survived the circuit, came back home in one piece with some accolades to boot. And
some money.
And some money, even better. Well done. What does it take to make a successful touring show? On a fringe circuit, because I'm sure it's completely different on a non-fringe circuit.
Fortitude. I remember talking to some comedians from Toronto who are based in Brooklyn right now, and their first time in Winnipeg, they had a really hard time. I had to let them know, like, hey, Winnipeg's a hard city to start out in. They tend to prefer people who've already gotten some accolades. The Fringe circuit is not the Toronto Fringe. I know that this has a large Toronto audience, this show. The Fringe circuit is not the Toronto Fringe. To the cities out west, they see more professional things touring. They have the concept of a professional touring Fringe show in their vocabulary, which is not necessarily something that Toronto has. Toronto is an up-and-comers market. Mm-hmm. And on the road, while there's that element there, especially in places like Edmonton, there's also people coming, especially from out west, especially from BC. Victoria and Vancouver have a lot of people who are pro fringe artists who do the circuit. Same thing with Portland. They start off in Orlando, they come across, they do Montreal. Sometimes they skip Toronto because, once again, Toronto works its fringe a bit differently. And so they don't necessarily get the same return when they're here. There's some that do come here. Martin Dockery, James and Jamesy, they've definitely had success here in Toronto. The Merkin sisters, Die Rotten Punkte.
Okay.
Definitely has had success in Toronto. But usually, on average, people who do successful out west and in Orlando, which somehow matches with out west, don't always do well in Toronto. And the ones that do well know how to do a show that reads to a variety of different audiences. They have fortitude. They know how to deal with the shows that do fail. They know how to make every audience feel special. They know how to pitch and let go. I find that because there's a lot of hand flying that you have to do, especially in Edmonton. If you're not willing to do that work, you're not going to do as well unless you're already quite established. Right. So some artists actually prefer Winnipeg because if you have good pre-press, Winnipeg can be a breeze for you. If you're a Mike Delamont, if you're one of these big artists, if you're a James and Jamesy, you can walk into Winnipeg and the newspaper kind of helps sell you, and it's pretty great, and you don't have to go out and flyer. And then it's like Edmonton comes along, and if you're in Edmonton, you have to flyer because people walk down to the fringe market, and it's literally a market in Edmonton. There's a giant, almost a fairground set up for the fringe in Edmonton with buskers out on the street doing, I don't want to call them free shows, but shows that you can pay what they're worth afterwards. Huge lineups to get into shows, and just people going around and flyering saying, hey, come and see this show next, come and see this show next. And if you're not willing to do that in Edmonton, if you're not good at walking up to strangers and explaining what your show is in under a minute, you're not going to do as well in Edmonton. Right. Like, you have to pitch.
So amongst your fortitude, amongst your ability to manage different crowds, help them feel special, one of the key qualities I'm hearing is the ability to make that pitch.
Oh, yeah.
Right. Take that out. What do you feel in terms of the work that you've done to be a success? What do you feel was most important as a Toronto artist going to, quote-unquote, a foreign city? I know you've done it before, so you've got some experience. But what do you feel has been the most important aspect of many of those things that you mentioned to help your success this time around?
Having done it before.
Okay. So experience.
Yeah. No. Well, as I said, for the markets in Winnipeg and Edmonton, there is the concept of a professional touring artist that's associated with the fringe. And so being a returning artist gives you that shine.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there are people who come to see my work because I've done work.
Right.
And that's going to be true for many people who, like, if you just have the fortitude and go back again and again, and your work, if it gets recognized, you're going to be able to be one of those people. And maybe this year you'll be up and next year you'll be down. You have to ride the roller coaster. TJ Jaw has a great show called Roller Coaster. It's a term a lot of fringe touring artists use because you might, come into Winnipeg, have done a great Orlando, done a great Montreal, think that you have a great show, and someone who just doesn't like you. This happened to John Bennett, who has done The Moth in the US, who's a big artist, a comedian in Australia, a touring artist in the Canadian fringe circuit. People love his work, and then one year he hit Winnipeg, and someone who just really didn't like his work, like didn't like him personally, basically, gave him a 1-star review, and that, with his location, just tanked his show for one city.
Interesting.
And then the next city, it picks up again.
Right.
Because he has the reputation, the fortitude.
Yeah.
So you have to be able to have enough cities on your docket that if one city tanks, you can afford it.
Right. And you get to ride the roller coaster.
That makes sense. So,
what challenges did you face doing this tour? Because 3 cities is a lot. In my mind, anyway. Maybe it's not. I've never toured like this.
My cat got sick at home, and I had to deal with phone calls with my husband where I was getting updates about a sick cat, where he was crying, and then I would have to go and
do a show,
or go and pitch a show, and just be like. And at one point in Edmonton, someone was like, "Oh, look, there's a cat on a leash. Why?" They knew that I was upset about my cat. They're like, "Why don't you go and play with that cat? It'll make you feel better." And then I went and tried to play with the cat, and I burst into tears in the middle of the fringe ground. So I had a sick cat, and it really affected my tour.
If you are going on tour, make sure your pets are in good health. Have them spayed or neutered before you leave.
So that was but it's the mental health strain of being away from home, and especially because a lot of Fringe touring artists are by themselves or in a very small, sometimes with one other person. It's really hard. And if you're a member of the BIPOC community or the LGBT community, there are barriers to access in touring that aren't always made apparent to people. A lot of the Fringe artists that tour are white straight men. There is an inherent advantage to touring culture that favors white straight men because of public safety issues.
Right.
And because the Fringe skewers white straight men, that also means that the representation is white, straight, and male. And so people from outside that community or outside that scope may not see the Fringe as a safe place to go and express themselves and express their art, especially in an environment where they have to go up to strangers and pitch.
Right.
There was a show called Monica versus the Internet this year at the Fringe that focused a lot. Well, in the show, it focused on the internet culture and what it was like to be a woman of color on the internet. But as this activist who does these great internet videos was touring the show, she was also calling out how white the Fringe was. And how, even though it claims to be a safe space and an open space, the incredible amount of whiteness means that to a person of color is inherently not a safe space. And what it means to, in a country where Fringe touring is such an advantage to a career, to be able to go and do that, what does it mean to artists of colors if they don't feel that that is for them, when representation becomes an access issue?
Right.
Because if you don't see people from your community in the space, you can't be assured that that is a safe space.
Right. That makes a lot of sense, and I can see that be a great challenge. And I appreciate you addressing it, and artists such as the show you were just referring to, Monica vs. Internet, because like anything else, the more that we've got foreground runners such as yourself stepping into it, the more people do that, the safer the space becomes, the more inclusive the community truly does grow to be, right? So congratulations and thank you in that note, because you're one of those forerunners right now.
Oh, thank you.
You may not recognize it yourself, but truly you're stepping into it. You just shared with myself and the audience about the fact that we've got an inclusive community, and like other things, there are challenges. It may not be as inclusive as we want it to be or hope it to be. People will feel it differently. I may not have noticed any of those things, as you said, because I'm a white straight male, right? And I go and I have a great time, and I'm not seeing it from your perspective. But your statements help bring that awareness forward and give light on the challenges you put forward. So thank you for that. And for those of you out there who may have thoughts or experiences that support Adam's perspective that maybe don't make it as safe a space, you've got a forerunner in front of you right here, ladies and gentlemen, as well as some encouragement to go out and help change the climate. Help take that step. Be courageous and address the issues. Monica versus the Internet, address the issues directly through your show. And encouragement for you out there. So we've talked about challenges you faced, successes and how you helped breed it. What was one of your, and you've talked about some of the joys of the accolades received. So putting the accolades aside, because obviously those are a highlight, what is one of the other major highlights of doing this tour this time for you?
I mean, connecting with other artists is always a big one. Getting to see, when you're on the road, the only form of entertainment that you really have accessible to you is the Fringe. So you end up seeing, like, when I do the Fringe in Toronto, if I see 13 shows, I feel like I saw 13 shows. But when I go out on the road, I tend to see a minimum of 20 shows per city.
Wow.
So getting to see all the other art, there's so much good art. I saw the After Party. I saw 13 Dead Dreams of Eugene. I saw Confessions of a Confederate War Widow in Hell. Some really fantastic things. A truly bizarre show from Japan called Are You Lovin' It? Which I don't even know how to describe. There was a breast tree at the end. Wow. Japan, what are you doing?
Fringe shows, ladies and gentlemen. They are unique.
They are very unique. Seeing masters and getting to know people like TJ Daw, who is a true master in the Canadian theatre scene, and also a script doctor for a lot of films that happen in Canada. He works at Vancouver, and he helps so many Fringe artists, and getting to know him on the road is great. Just, people like Martin Dockery, getting to see work by them. There's so many great people on the road, great shows to see. I think that's the big highlight.
It makes sense.
Well, because everything that we do is so you do the Fringe because you're doing a bizarre show, like because
Yes.
your art, especially if you're one of the touring artists, your art is not going to be put up at the Tarragon or the Factory or the Arts
Not
and
typically.
Letters Club in Vancouver, or you're doing something that is one of a kind, probably. And so being on the road and getting to share that with other people who kind of understand your process and are enjoying it, like TJ Daw saw my show and gave me 2 big thumbs up. And then immediately afterwards, he's asking me, but he's like, but what made you think that was a Fringe show? and like after 2 big thumbs up, he still was like it was clearly something that he would never have, been like, oh yes, let's do this historic story on stage by yourself. That makes sense. But these shows that go on, like Fleabag, just won Best Comedy Emmy. Fleabag, as well as I think writing Emmy, it won a Best Actor Emmy and maybe a Best Director for comedy series. Okay. Fleabag is a Fringe show. That's how it started off. It was a one-woman Fringe show, and so that kind of thing, going up and winning the Emmys, that's a big deal, and that's the sort of art that we created. So, because that's a show about a sex addict that would not have gotten greenlit
Anywhere else.
Yeah. But someone saw it at the Fringe
and we've got to move it.
Yeah.
So that leads me to my final question of the day, which I was thinking about as you said it. First off, I want to recognize that you spoke about the challenge. One of the challenges you face is potentially the unseen and unspoken barriers within community, right? And yet, the highlight for you, in its absolute contrast, was the community itself, which speaks to that larger body of awesomeness that a Fringe show can be.
Yeah.
But we're not detracting from the possible challenges that people may face, and I again put the encouragement to get out there and help to change those challenges, which leads me to that final question. All of that build up to this. In there, you spoke about how Fringe is unique. The shows typically are unique. Fleabag being, in this case, a little bit of an exception. Is it possible, or is it common, any of the above, however you want to look at this and address it, that a Fringe performer equals anything more than a Fringe performer?
Absolutely.
In terms of, and because I don't want to slag any performers, I'm a Fringe performer myself, and we do all sorts of stuff. We're performers, period. There's no lesser than or bigger than. I'm referring to in terms of social acceptance, in terms of, oh, you're a Fringe person, not a movie person, or whatever snobbery may go with that kind of statement.
I mean, it changes from place to place. As I said, like if you're there are Fringe celebrities.
Right.
Like if you are Mike Delamont and you are in Edmonton or Winnipeg, you are a giant Fringe celebrity, and right. People treat you as such. And then you might turn around and do a comedy festival somewhere else where you're just an average. The neat thing about the Fringe is that you can be something somewhere and then go back home and just be your normal self. Like in Winnipeg, I've had people buy me dinners. One of my friends came out to see the show in Winnipeg, and she was surprised to find out that I actually had fans, like people who are just right. my fans. And I was like, yeah, of course I do. Why would I be out here if I didn't have that? Yeah. But I mean, like as I said, TJ Daw is also a huge script doctor. The movie The F Word is one of the movies that it's based on a play that he wrote. Martin Dockery has performed off Broadway. John Patterson is the artistic director of a theater out on the East Coast, and he does the Fringe. So I'm thinking, of course and I mean, there's some people who just do Fringe. They do the Canadian circuit in the summer, and then the Australian circuit in the winter, and they just keep doing that. I think you can be as much or as little as you want to be when it comes to this. So
that makes sense.
So I think the same thing like a YouTube artist can probably be, there's all sorts of varieties of YouTube artists. Some will stay bloggers and some will go on to take over the world.
Agreed. Very much agreed. So making the most of your situation in the bottom end leads you to be whom you are.
Yeah.
Yeah. And barriers can be transcended. You're not just one thing.
Absolutely not. A great example would, once again, like John Bennett, who I mentioned earlier, stand-up comedian in Australia. He's been on The Moth in the States. And then in Canada, he is a circuit artist. Like, it just depends on where you are.
Makes sense. Well, Adam, thank you for coming in. That brings us to a close on
you.
our time.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen out there, these are your thoughts in the green room. It's the interview series. Obviously, Adam Bailey, the fabulous and talented, in studio with us once again. I appreciate that you came back, and I know my viewers are as well, because we want to hear how wonderfully your tour went. Congratulations on it.
And thank you.
You're welcome. We'll see you in a couple weeks, folks. Till then.
It was John Truby, The Anatomy of Story. That was the story doctor I was talking about.